Let's talk about Leviticus chapter 2. If you were watching this, I'm going to assume that you've been watching the videos up to this point. Of course, this is the second video, so it just means you've watched one. But I'm going to assume that you basically know what is going on so far in the book of Leviticus. I'm going to assume that there's a good chance that you've been watching the Exodus videos, the Genesis videos, and so forth. So you have the basic context that you would need to understand what is going on here in Leviticus 2. So I'm just going to jump right in, pick up exactly where we left off yesterday and start breaking it down. We talked about the burnt offering in our previous video. Now we are going to talk about the next type of offering, the grain offering. All the same things that we said in the last video talking about the burnt offering are also true here for the grain offering. I'm going to repeat one of the really big ones today. I'm going to repeat it in probably almost every video if I had to guess. But that is that just like the burnt offering, the grain offering is not a way of saving your soul. None of the sacrifices or offerings were about saving our souls. Nothing about the sacrificial system or the priestly system or the tabernacle system was about finding salvation. These are not things that the ancient Israelites had to do in order to be saved. These are things the Lord gave the Israelites to do because of the fact that they are saved. But every single redeemed person from the time of Adam and Eve after getting kicked out of the garden all the way to today, every single redeemed person has been redeemed by Jesus Christ. No one in all of history has ever saved themselves, not by following the law, not by good works, not by performing these sacrifices and offerings. None of these are about saving us. What all of these sacrifices and offerings are about is preparing us to understand the sacrifice of Jesus. The passage that I read in the first video, I'm going to read it again. It is Hebrews 10, verses 1 through 4. There's actually quite a few other passages that we could read. Maybe I'll mix it up throughout the rest of the Leviticus series and read some of the other ones just so that you can get those rattling around in your head as well. But Hebrews 10, 1 through 4 says, "For the law, having a shadow of the good things to come, not the very image of the things, can never, with the same sacrifices year by year, which they offer continually, make perfect those who draw near, or else they wouldn't they have ceased to be offered. Because the worshipers, having once been cleansed, would have no more consciousness of sins. But in those sacrifices there is a yearly reminder of sins, for it is impossible that the blood of bulls and goats should take away sins." The point the author of Hebrews is making is that nothing from the Old Testament system, including the sacrifices, was ever about winning your salvation. The Old Testament law was not for people trying to be saved. The Old Testament law was for people who were already saved. It was a protective straitjacket to keep God's people from destroying themselves between the days of the Exodus and the day when the long-promised Savior would come. It was a tutor, Paul says in the book of Galatians, a teaching tool in order to teach God's people who God is and what He is like and what He wants for us and from us. It was meant to shape God's people into a people who reflect His goodness and His glory and His character and His attributes, His will and His ways, to form God's people into a people who reflect this God to the surrounding pagan nations. And that same thing is true for these sacrifices here. That same thing is true here in Leviticus 2 when it comes to the grain offering, just like it was true for the burnt offering. And so let's talk about how God is using the grain offering as a teaching tool to teach His people during the Old Testament days who He is, what He's like, what He wants for us and from us, His will and His ways, to shape His people into a community that reflects His goodness and His glory. Here's the simplest way I can think of to put it. The grain offering was, like all the others, it was an image, a symbol, a metaphor. We are not meant to misunderstand and believe that the grain offering literally did anything. It wasn't magic. It wasn't sorcery. It wasn't occultism. It was an image, symbol, a metaphor. It was a teaching tool. And it teaches us what? It teaches us to see the Lord as our King. It sounds weird, but we're going to talk about it. Doing the grain offering week after year, over and over and over, would have taught you every single time you did it, every single time you watched somebody else did it, every single time you heard somebody doing it from your tent, and so on and so forth. It would remind you God is our king, God is our master, God is the term that we can use essentially is God is our suzerain. I'm going to explain that. God is our feudal Lord. It is as if we are his serfs and he is the Lord over this territory. It is as if we are his vassals and he is the suzerain over this land. In the ancient Near East, almost every place was a feudal system. That meant that there were certain people who owned the land in each territory and everybody else rented the land from them, worked on the land, and paid rents in order to live on and work and be supported by the bounty of that lord's land. And so a certain percentage of your harvest every year would go to your feudal lord. A certain percentage of the offspring of your flocks would go to your feudal lord. A certain percentage of basically all the different fruits of your labor would go to the feudal lord who owns the land that you are working on. And a very similar thing was happening on a bigger scale. Small tribes or villages or small nations would pay tribute to a bigger, more powerful nation that might want to conquer them or attack them and exploit them. Those smaller tribes or villages or small nations would enter into that covenant with a suzerain. Essentially, the vassals would say, we will serve this suzerain, and in return, this suzerain will protect us. We will be faithful to our suzerain. We will pay our tributes to our suzerain, and our suzerain will protect us from that other nation that wants to conquer us and steal our land and rape our women and kill our men and enslave our children. It was a vassal suzerain treaty or a vassal suzerain covenant. You would pay tributes to the suzerain in the same way that on an individual scale, you, the serfs, would pay tributes from your harvests and your flocks and so on and so forth to your feudal lord. What the grain offering is doing is teaching us not that we are literally serfs and that he is literally a feudal lord, not that we are literally vassals and he's literally a suzerain, because very often the feudal lord was bad, right? Very often the feudal lord was himself exploiting his serfs. Often the vassal nations were exploiting the suzerains were exploiting the smaller, weaker vassal nations and stuff like that. So it's not like a perfect metaphor, but that the order of power, the order of authority, the relationship between us and him is like that relationship between serf and feudal lord, vassal and suzerain, that he is the one who owns the land we live on. We just live on his land. He is the one who owns the crops that we harvest. We just live off his crops. He is the one who owns the livestock that feeds us. We just live off his livestock. He is the one who owns us. He owns our bodies. We live in bodies that he owns. He owns our souls. We exist in souls that he owns. Every aspect of our lives belongs to him. He owns absolutely everything that is us, absolutely everything around us, absolutely everything we are a part of, absolutely everything that we do. All of it belongs wholly to this God. He is the ultimate Lord, the ultimate suzerain. And the way that God's people would remind themselves of that over and over and over and over was through the grain offering. You are giving the first fruits of your harvest to the Lord the same way a serf would give the first fruits of their harvest to their feudal lord. And every time we would make that grain offering from the first fruits of our harvest, we are declaring to ourselves, I am owned by Yahweh. And we are declaring to the Lord, Yahweh, you own me. It says Leviticus 1, when anyone offers an offering of a meal offering or a grain offering to Yahweh, his offering shall be fine flour. He shall pour oil on it and put frankincense on it. Now, how would that remind them in some way of God's absolute ownership of everything around us and of our own bodies and souls? The way it would do that is that the grain offering was quite literally modeled after the ancient Near Eastern tribute gifts that serfs would give to lords, that vassals would give to suzerains. You would take your first fruits, you would take your best grains to the priest in the same way that you would take your tribute to the Lord or the suzerain. It says in verse 2, he shall bring it to Aaron's sons, priests. He shall take it from there, his handful of its fine flour and of its oil with all its frankincense. The priest shall burn its memorial portion on the altar, an offering made by fire of a pleasant aroma to Yahweh. Essentially what's happening here is that I offering the Lord the first fruits of your harvests, all the first fruits of your grains and everything like that. What it reminds you is, I may have this grain, but it ultimately came from him. I may be offering this to him, but he ultimately is the one who brought it into existence. He created the land that I planted these seeds into, and therefore he owns the land I planted these seeds into. He created the fruit-bearing plants that I am now planting into the ground and cultivating, and therefore he owns all of these fruit-bearing plants. He brought about the weather patterns that made it possible for these things to even grow in the ground. He created the rain that rains down onto the ground and then causes these seeds to burst forth into plants. He created the elements that fertilize the ground and make it fertile rather than barren, and on and on. He therefore owns all these things. Literally all of it ultimately comes from him. I am enjoying the fruits of his labor, even as I now give back to him the fruits of my labor. And in fact, he is the one who made it possible for me to labor in the first place. He is the one who gave me the bones and the blood and the muscles and the energy. He is the one who put the breath in my lungs, the life in my body. I am able to cultivate these fields because he has made me able to cultivate these fields. So literally anything that I do in these fields is something the Lord has done through me. It's something he's enabled me to do. My labor is labor he has enabled me to do. So when I labor for Yahweh, ultimately he's the one supplying my labor. When I make something and give it to Yahweh, he is ultimately the one who is enabling me to make something and give it back to him. All that I can ever give the Lord is stuff that's already his in the first place. There is nothing that is mine. Everything that is mine is his, and I am his. And so every time you got those first fruits of your harvest, you got those grains, you would be reminded again and again and again that the sacks of fine flour that you are carrying to the priest ultimately belong to him, because he owns all the land, he owns all the produce, owns all the grains, he owns the fruits of our labor, he owns our labor, he owns us, the laborers. And it actually illustrates that in a pretty funny way. We talked in the last video about the fact that they did not primarily learn by listening to lessons and lectures back in the ancient Near East. The primary way that they learned was through doing. It was through hands-on things. It was through rituals, through ceremonies, through other things like that. We're packed with metaphorical charge. And the same thing is happening here in the grain offering, because it lists off a whole bunch of different ways that you can prepare the grain offering. But the one thing all of them have in common is that they are very labor intensive. It was actually really hard work to prepare the grain offering. It's funny, we think of the grain offering almost like a diet offering, like a junior offering, because it doesn't involve killing an animal. And yet, this was extremely hard work. This is like back-breaking, labor-intensive work. As Leviticus 2:4-7, when you offer an offering of a meal or a grain offering baked in the oven, it shall be unleavened cakes of fine flour mixed with oil, or unleavened wafers anointed with oil. If your offering is a grain offering of the baking pan, it shall be of fine flour, unleavened, mixed with oil. You shall cut it into pieces and pour oil on it as a grain offering. If your offering is a meal offering of the frying pan, it shall be made of fine flour with oil. These are all things that actually take a really long time. These are really difficult to do. There's a lot going in this. None of these are simple or easy. This is genuinely very labor intensive. You have to do a lot. You have to labor pretty hard in order to prepare your grain offering. And so what happens if you're an ancient Israelite going through all these labor intensive steps to prepare the grain offering? Whichever form you do, you can deep fry it, you can bake it, but all of it is labor intensive. We're going to be reminded all of this labor is enabled by God himself. He's the one who made it possible for me to harvest this grain and then bake it in the oven. He's the one who made it possible for me to cover these grains with oil and then prepare them. He's the one who made it possible for me to fry these grains in the fine flour with the oil, and on and on and on. God owns the land. He owns the produce. He owns the grains. He owns the fruits of my labor. He is the one who enabled my labor to begin with. And then after he enabled my labor, he enabled the ground to actually give forth these grains in this harvest. It's really important that specifically they would make the grain offering with the first fruits of the harvest. So the first yields that came out of the harvest. That is what they used for the grain offering. They did not use the leftovers that came after they had already done everything else they needed to do, set up their storehouses, eaten their fill, made sure they had stuff saved for later and stuff like that. Then get whatever's left over and go give it to Yahweh. That is not what they did. They gave him the first fruits of the harvest. The first usable grains that came forth each harvest season. That was what went to the Lord. Why? It's very simple. It's because, one, you are acknowledging the reason that we have these first yields in the first place is because you made this successful harvest possible. This is a couple books from now, but in Deuteronomy chapter, we see a really clear example of this. It says, lest you say in your heart, my power and the might of my hand has gotten me this wealth, you shall remember Yahweh your God, for it is he who gives you power to get wealth, that he may establish his covenant, which he swore to your fathers as it is today. He's saying, you are not the one who made yourself wealthy. The Lord made you wealthy. You are not the one who made yourself powerful. The Lord made you powerful. And in the same way now, here, Leviticus 2:14, if you offer a grain offering of the first fruits to Yahweh, you shall offer for the grain offering of your first fruits, grain in the ear, parched with fire, crushed grain of the fresh. What it's saying is the first yields that come, you give as a grain offering to the Lord as a way of acknowledging you are the one who made my crops actually work because they didn't have to. And so first you're acknowledging his faithfulness in the past. You gave me a successful harvest. And I'm acknowledging that by giving you the first yields that it gives. But even more than that, you are also declaring something about the future. You are declaring, I trust you. I trust that in the same way that you made this first yield successful, you will also make the rest of the harvest successful. You were saying, we trust you to make the rest of our harvest succeed. We trust you to provide for us. We trust you to sustain us. We trust you to take care of us. We trust you to protect us. You're saying, we trust that you will give us our food at the proper time. You will give us our daily bread. You will give us what we need, when we need it, how we need it. We don't have to worry about anything. There's two really weird things that we should talk about when it comes to the grain offering. The first is that there were some things you could not include in your grain offering. And the second is that there are some things that you had to include in your grain offering. And both of them probably strike us as weird. If you watched the Exodus series videos, then that one of the, keys to understanding a lot of what is happening just in the Old Testament in general, but especially in the law codes throughout the second half of Exodus, as well as Leviticus, quite a bit of Numbers, and Deuteronomy, is that just like today, we associate certain things with certain ideas. They did the same thing. The example I always use is we associate fresh white linen sheets with cleanness, but fresh brown linen sheets are just as clean as fresh white linen sheets. They both came out of the same washing machine and dryer. But we don't automatically just associate fresh brown linen sheets with cleanness, even though they're the same amount of clean. It is totally arbitrary. It is just a thing that we've culturally associated with this idea. Same thing was true. We talked in Exodus about the fact that they, back in the ancient Near East, associated gold with purity. They associated bronze with purification. In general, they associated silver with redemption, whether we're talking about redeeming someone from prison, redeeming someone from debt, redeeming someone from slavery, and so on and so forth. Often they would use these silver pieces as the payment to redeem. And so whenever you saw something silver, whether you even consciously clocked it or not, you would, in the back of your mind, think of redeeming someone either from slavery, debt, prison, whatever. They associated the color purple with royalty. They associated the color blue with divinity, the realm of the gods and so on. They associated the color red or scarlet with sacrifice, atonement, and so forth. And as a result, so much of what is in the tabernacle is gold or silver or bronze or purple or blue or scarlet and all these other different things that would have associated with these concepts. And so actually the sights, the sounds, the smells even within the tabernacle testifies to the purity of the Lord and the way that he's purifying us, the way that he has redeemed us, the kingship of the Lord, the godhood of Yahweh, the way that he is atoning for us through the blood of the long-promised Savior and beyond. It is actually testifying to these things without words sometimes. Same thing is happening here when it comes to the grain offering. It says no leaven or honey can be used in the grain offering. This is verse 11. No grain offering which you shall offer to Yahweh shall be made with yeast or leaven. You shall burn no yeast nor any honey as an offering made by fire to Yahweh. Now this is only in relation to the grain offering. There are other offerings that we're going to see down the line where they do use yeast and other things like that. So don't make a mistake. But in Leviticus 2, and then actually again in Leviticus, remember we talked about the fact that we're not going to have a video on Leviticus because we're going to talk about basically everything in Leviticus throughout the other videos, because Leviticus just follows up. It's more stuff about burnt offerings, more stuff about grain offerings, and on and on. But in Leviticus 17 it says, it shall not be baked with yeast. I have given it as their portion of my offerings made by fire. It is most holy as the sin offering and as the trespass offering. So you couldn't use leaven in any of the things that you either bake or fry or whatever for the grain offering. You couldn't use honey for any of the stuff that you used for the grain offering. Why? It's because in the ancient Near East, just like they associated gold with this, silver with that, purple with this, and on and on. I'm trying to think of the way to put this exactly, but they often associated things like yeast or just any leavening agent in general with decay, with corruption. Not always, actually. It's interesting. We're going to talk more about this later. They didn't always associate leavening agents like yeast with decay and corruption. Sometimes they associated it with positive things in very different ways. In the same way that we associate all kinds of different things with both good things and bad things, right? We associate guns with good things in some contexts. We associate it with bad things in other contexts. We associate dogs with like man's best friend in some contexts, and we associate dogs with like wild roaming packs that attack us in the streets in other contexts. So it's not weird that they would sometimes associate leaven with good things, metaphorically, and other times with bad things. But one of the bad things that they often associated it with was decay or corruption. When you leavened your bread, it had a much shorter shelf life, right? Unleavened bread, typically, it would last a lot longer. You were much more likely to get some infection or disease or fungus or whatever from a leavened piece of bread than from an unleavened one. Same thing was true when it came to like honey. They associated honey like yeast and other leavening agents. They associated it with like fermentation, which fermentation was very good in some contexts, very bad in other contexts. They loved fermentation when it came to like fermenting wine and other things like that. Weren't so big on fermentation in some other contexts. They associated both leaven, yeast, honey, all these different things, leavening agents, fermenting agents, with decay and corruption in a lot of contexts. As a result, you couldn't use anything like that in the grain offering. Why? Because it's a reminder. Decay comes from the fall. Corruption comes from the fall. The decay they associated leavening and fermenting agents with sometimes is a direct reminder of the fact that the world is not what it is supposed to be. This is not the world as God created it. This is a fallen world. This is a broken world filled with death, filled with suffering, filled with grief, filled with sickness and injustice and despair and loss and so on. And it is not supposed to be that way. And it is not going to be that way when all is said and done, because the Lord is raising this world back up from the pit. One day there will be no decay or corruption. Right now, this world, of which the Lord owns everything, still does not reflect what God created it to be. And yet one day, this world that God owns and the people in this world that God owns will be exactly as we were created to be, and it will be glorious. And they symbolized that through the fact that you could not use any leavening or fermenting agent in your grain offering, but you had to use a preserving agent. You had to use salt. Says Leviticus 2:13. Every offering of your grain offering you shall season with salt. You shall not allow the salt of the covenant of your God to be lacking from your grain offering. With all your offerings you shall offer salt. Now, my wife will tell you that salt makes literally everything better. I don't really put salt on anything. I do put a ton of like black pepper and paprika and other stuff like that into just straight up everything, to the point that it maybe ruins some things. But I'm not a big salt guy, but she is huge on salt. That is actually not the primary reason why you must put salt into your grain offerings. It's not because God likes the taste better when there's salt, because again, remember, like we talked about in the last video, this is a metaphor. It's an image. It is a symbol. This represents something. It is as if the Lord is eating the offering, but he's not literally eating the offering. God doesn't need to eat anything. He doesn't have a stomach that needs to be filled. He doesn't experience hunger. But salt is required in all of the baked grain offerings because the ancient Near Eastern culture associated salt with preservation. It was a preserving agent. You would pack fish with salt to preserve it on long journeys. You would pack other meats with salt to preserve it. You would pack, there was all kinds of different things you would do. You would use salt as this preserving agent, and it was a game changer. People did not die who might otherwise have died because they had preserving agents like salt to make it possible to transport the food to where it needed to be so that people wouldn't starve, and so on and so forth. It would preserve your resources, and by preserving your resources, things like salt would preserve your life. And so you associated salt just in the back of your mind without even thinking about it. You associated it with the way that you have been preserved as a result of it. You've been protected and sustained as a result of it. You are still here because you are being preserved. And so what's happening here is that the necessity of using salt as a preserving agent in your baked grain offering is actually going to remind you in a weird way that you may not even grasp at first of the way that God's covenant faithfulness to us is enduring. We have been preserved by the covenant faithfulness of the Lord through absolutely everything. Even when we have fallen short, even when we've drifted away, even when we have stumbled, still we have been preserved. Not by our covenant faithfulness to Him, because our covenant faithfulness is wildly inconsistent. We've been preserved by His covenant faithfulness to us. And as weird as it sounds, you're going to be reminded of that every single time you carry out the grain offering and you bake the salt into it. But there's one less strange thing that we need to talk about when it comes to the grain offering. And this actually comes as well from Leviticus chapter. Because in Leviticus, it picks back up talking about the grain offering, and it says something really interesting. It says, beginning in verse 22, the anointed priest who will be in his place from among his sons shall offer the grain offering. By a perpetual statute, it shall be wholly burned to Yahweh. Every grain offering of a priest shall be wholly burned. It shall not be eaten. So it picks back up talking about the grain offering, but it starts talking about a very specific type of grain offering. Depending on your translation that you're reading, it may be says the ordination offering of grain, or the anointing offering of grain, the consecration offering, whatever it is. Essentially, they would make a grain offering in the process of ordaining priests to the priesthood. Now, we're going to talk a lot about the priestly ordination process as we get further into Leviticus. But right here, we're just going to dip our foot in, because as Leviticus is further elaborating on the grain offering, one of the things that it points out is that there were different purposes behind the different grain offerings. And so the standard grain offering that every other Israelite would offer consistently is exactly like we just described. But when you were ordaining a new priest, it seems, you would also make grain offering. And when you would do this grain offering as part of the priestly ordination, one of the things that was very strange was that you couldn't eat any of the baked grain offering. Like I said in the last video, most of the time, the sacrifice or the offering would be split either 2 or 3 ways. It would either be split between the worshiper and Yahweh, or it'd be split between the priest and Yahweh, or it would be split 3 ways between the worshiper and the priest and Yahweh. But during the ordination service, when they would make the ordination grain offering for the newly anointed priest, the priest couldn't eat any of it. There was no other worshiper to eat any of it. All of it would simply be burned. It was as if the Lord was eating all of it. So like the burnt offering. These are 2 very unusual cases. But the reason they would do that was because the ordination grain offering was considered to be for Yahweh alone. So none of this bread is for the priest being ordained. None of this bread is for any of the worshipers. This bread is only for Yahweh. All of it is devoted for Yahweh. All of it belongs to Yahweh. All of it is surrendered to Yahweh. It's meant to represent the way that as a priest, being set apart, consecrated, dedicated, ordained to the priesthood, all of your labor belongs to the Lord, but in a unique way. That was already true of all of the Israelites, as we see in the regular grain offering, but it's true in a very particular way with the priest, a very unique way. As the priest, you are not only working the ground and then giving the fruits of your labor to the Lord, you are actively working on behalf of the Lord. You are working as the hands and feet of the Lord in the community. You are doing what He has sent you to do. You are saying what He has sent you to say. You are teaching what He's sent you to taught. You are acting on His behalf for the people, and you are acting on the people's behalf for Him. So your work is uniquely devoted to the Lord. It actually doesn't mean that it's better than the agricultural work or other things like that. It's that the agricultural work in the fields is wholly devoted to the Lord in one way, and then the priestly work, mediation, is wholly devoted to the Lord in this other unique way. In other words, no matter what your station in life is, no matter where you fall on the social ladder, no matter what your job is, what your family is, what your role in the community is, regardless of any of those things, the thing that absolutely every member of God's people has in common is that every aspect of our life belongs to the Lord. Every aspect of our life is devoted to the Lord. Every aspect of our life exists in order to be in service of the Lord. Whether you're a farmer or a priest or a merchant, whatever, all of what you do originates with the Lord's good, generous gift, and ultimately comes back around and terminates on your response of worship through offering the first fruits of your harvests to the Lord. That is Leviticus chapter. That's all that we're going to have time for in this video, but I'll pick it back up in Leviticus in the next one. I hope it's not an individual video for every single chapter, because I really want to hurry up and lay the rest of this out, because I think it's going to help with a lot of what you are reading day after day. But hit me up with whatever questions that you have about Leviticus 2, about the grain offering and so forth, and I will tackle them either in the comments here in this YouTube video or in the comments in the Let's Read Scripture Together Facebook group. But between now and then, love you guys, take care, and keep reading. Hey, what's up? It's Pastor Ryan from Mount Zion Baptist Church. I'm extremely glad that you watched our video, and I hope that the Lord used it to speak to you in a very powerful and specific way. Hit the like and subscribe buttons on this video so that you can keep up with everything that we put out and we come up a little bit higher in your algorithm, and send a personal message to our YouTube account. I would love to hear from you, get to know you, pray with you a little bit. Between now and then, take care.